Let's see. Good evening and welcome. Tonight we have the privilege of welcoming Dr. Patrick Gray, a professor of religious studies at Rhodes College, where he started teaching in 2002. The Monday after the Friday that he finished his PhD. So he was fresh out of Emory University. Before coming to Memphis, he's taught at Oglethorpe University in Atlanta and also in Japan. He has published several books on the New Testament and early Christianity, though he's not sure how many people have actually read any of them. He and his wife have 3 children and are parishioners at St. Louis Catholic Church in Memphis. So we welcome Dr. Gray.
Thanks. Thank you for the invitation to come. I've never been to Cocktails and Catholicism here or to Holy Spirit, so again, thank you for the invitation. As you said, I teach at Rhodes College, and so most of my students are 18, 19 years old. Often my classes are at 8 a.m. in the morning. I don't know about your kids were probably different, but most 18-year-olds, when they get excited about going off to college, it's not because they get to study the classics with a highly trained scholar. Like I said, your kids, I'm sure, were different. That's why they went to college and got excited about that. So anyway, when I get a chance to talk to a group like this, when people are here of their own free will, I always like that, even if it's just for the food and the cocktails. So, all right, so the topic that I gave when asked was orphans and widows in the early church. I want to start with one verse from the letter of James. This is a letter from the New Testament. James is like part of the family of Jesus, and he wrote this letter. He's talking about faith and how you live out your faith. And there's one line that kind of provides an introduction for what I want to talk about today, and it's in chapter 1, verse 27. And James says, religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to care for orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself unstained by the world. That's a pretty bold statement. This is what religion is caring for orphans and widows. Now, it's a little bit of an exaggeration. He's not saying that that's all that religion is. There's more to it than that, but that's like when he reaches for an example of what true religion is, he talks about taking care of widows and orphans. So, you have to understand something about ancient Rome to understand the situation of widows and orphans here, and that's what we're going to try to do. And then understanding something about widows and orphans helps us understand something about the early church. So that's what we're going to try to cover here in our time this evening. Now, when I say ancient Rome, I don't mean just the city of Rome that we've been seeing a lot on the news because of the election of the Pope and so forth. Rome, ancient Rome in the first century when the church gets started, is not just the city of Rome, not just the Italian peninsula. It's basically the entire Mediterranean, all the way over in the west. Great Britain was part of the Roman Empire in the first century. So you got Rome and Spain and France and Germany and Italy, Greece, modern-day Turkey, the Holy Land. So Israel is part of the Roman Empire in the first century. And then big swaths of northern Africa. So when I say Rome, I'm talking about all of that in the Mediterranean. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about what we know from outside the Bible about orphans and especially widows. We know more about widows than we know about orphans. And then look at a thing or two in the New Testament and see how this information opens that up and helps us see things that we might not otherwise see. So that's what we're going to try to do here in our time. So you with me? Are we good? All right, so first orphans, just a little bit, and then widows. Now orphans, everybody knows what an orphan is, right? Orphan is someone who doesn't have any parents. Well, that's the way it is in most modern languages, but in ancient languages, at least in ancient Greece and Rome, you were an orphan if you had lost either parent. Even if you had like your mother still alive or your father still alive, you were an orphan if you'd lost one of them. Now normally, in most cases, who is going to die first, the mother or the father? All else being equal, it's more likely that the father is going to die first. And so often when you called someone an orphan, it meant someone who had lost their father. Men tended to marry later than women. at a later age, so 7 or 8 years later, and then they tended to also die earlier because of a variety. Women would die early because of, like childbirth and things like that, but men had other things that they died from, and they tended to die. Like in most cultures, in most countries, most times, women have a higher life expectancy than men. And so when you put all those factors together, you had a lot of fathers dying, and then you also had a lot of mothers dying in the ancient world. When you look at the numbers, and we can look at a lot of different kind of records that we have from ancient Rome, you can kind of get a good sense of how many people were orphans. And it's estimated that in their teenage years, or by their teenage years, over 1/3 of all children in the Roman world were orphans. Over 1/3 of them. Now that means they lost one or the other parent, but what's called a complete orphan is someone who's lost both parents. That's what we think of as orphans. And it's thought that about 10% of all children in the first century were complete orphans. So 1 out of every 10. We got a lot of orphans in our society, but nothing like 10% of all children. And another figure that kind of stunned me when I did the research on this is that only 1 out of every 5 children would reach adulthood with both of their parents alive. So 4 out of every, you do the math, 4 out of every 5 children wouldn't make it to an adulthood with a parent alive. So that's, so you've got orphans all over the place in the ancient Roman world. It's kind of surprising given that they are mentioned so infrequently in the New Testament. They're all over the place. The passage I read from the gospel, or from the letter of James, is one of the few explicit places where it talks about orphans. But they're all over the place. And they're related to this other group that we're talking about, which is widows, right? When you have a bunch of men dying early, you not only have technical orphans, but you also have, of course, widows. And here, the idea, there's some exceptions to this rule, but generally a widow, what they called a widow is what we called a widow, someone whose husband is deceased. So with all these dead men dying prematurely, you have a lot of widows. Most women in the ancient world would sooner or later end up as a widow. That's maybe not so different from our world, again, because men tend to outlive women. Now, fewer women get married nowadays. That's a changing demographic fact, but still, I think most women get married, and so all other things being equal, they're going to outlive their husbands. But the stats really are quite different when we look at the ancient Roman world in the first century. At any given time, it's estimated that about 25 or 30% of all women were widows. That's a lot of widows, right? And widowhood might be a brief state for some women, so until they are remarried or until they die. But some it would be like you're a widow for quite a long time. Women often became widows in their early 30s. That's a real difference. You have some widows in their 30s in our culture, but that's not the norm, is it? But because of that, and through analysis of a lot of different things like tax records and tombstones that we have in various cemeteries, it's thought that the average age of the widow in the ancient Roman world was 52. So that's the average. So when we think about kind of the image for many of us that's conjured by the term widow in English, of an elderly woman, that's not the norm. Because widows would be younger than, what constitutes elderly, I guess, is kind of subjective. But I mean, if we say like the age 60, and I'm going to talk about why I'm going to pick out that date in a few minutes. But if we say 60 makes you elderly, there just aren't even that many elderly women, widowed or not, in the ancient world because of life expectancy kind of reasons, right? So you've got a lot of widows, a lot more widows than we have in our culture. And widows, women of childbearing age, were generally encouraged and expected to remarry. That would have been the norm. There was social pressure to get remarried if you're a widow, but there was also, in the first century, actually legal pressure to get remarried. like we're starting to experience in our world, there was kind of population decline. And so the Emperor Augustus Caesar, the nephew of Julius Caesar, he passed a law in the first century. He saw how things were going, and he wanted widows to get remarried and people to have children. And so he actually passed a law that imposed penalties for women up to age 50 if you did not get remarried. So there's this kind of like, and the penalty often took the form of liabilities in terms of inheritance law. Like you couldn't pass down or inherit certain kinds of property if you did not get remarried when you were widowed below the age 50. So this is like a kind of a nudge to get people to get remarried. It didn't seem, it didn't seem to work, but they tried. But there's social pressure. There's sometimes legal pressure. But by the age 50, the likelihood of a widow getting remarried was decreasing. It didn't tend to happen very much over the age of 50. Remarriage didn't really have any stigma, social stigma, perhaps because so many people had to get remarried because widowhood was so common. Often there is this ideal, you stay unmarried out of devotion to the deceased husband. But again, there was no like real stigma, like, people looked at you bad if you got remarried. But there were a range of different kinds of attitudes towards widows and stereotypes. I'm not endorsing these stereotypes, I'm just passing them along. But widows could often be seen as headstrong or stubborn, busybodies, of loose morals, and they like to drink. I'm not endorsing this stereotype. I'm just passing it along. That's what people said. But then on the other end, you had the stereotype of widows who didn't get remarried as, kind of models of fidelity, that sort of thing too. So you had a wide different range of attitudes towards widows. And a lot of widows, and again, this is based on, most of it's based on written records and also like fictional stories where you get a kind of an idea of what life was like, even though it's kind of fiction. There are a lot of widows who really enjoyed the freedom they had now that they didn't have a husband. They didn't have that authority over them, and so they really enjoyed it, too much so in the eyes of many of their contemporaries. You're enjoying being single too much. But for most widows, whatever freedom and liberties they had now that they were free in that sense, most of the time really the burdens outweighed any kinds of freedoms because you were dependent on your husband in almost all cases for just a livelihood. And we get constant reminders in the writings of ancient Greeks and Romans that you really need to take care of your widowed mother, your elder, your grandmother. And they say you don't make a law against things nobody's doing. You don't chastise people for things they're already doing a good job of. So the fact that people are constantly saying we really ought to be looking after your widowed mothers tells us people didn't always do it, right? And there was very little in ancient Rome in the way of a public welfare safety net. So like we have now, no Social Security Administration in ancient Rome. Who took care of you? It was usually your family or nobody. Now one thing, and this is relevant to early Christianity, the earliest Christians were all Jewish, right? So before the church, there was the synagogue. And the church is not exactly like a synagogue, but it's kind of, as a social institution, kind of model on that, especially if you're coming out of Judaism. This is what we do. And so one thing that synagogues were known for in the ancient, Mediterranean, Jews were a minority everywhere, but they were like a sizable minority. People like synagogue, they take care of their own. They take care of widows and their own widows and orphans in any way. So other than that, there's not a big kind of welfare social safety net there. It was usually dire straits that you were falling into if you were widowed, right? Now you might if you had a wealthy husband, have an inheritance that would allow you to not be destitute. So you had that, but that's not most women. Usually children, even if you were wealthy, usually the children were favored over the wife in the father's will. So the money might not go to you, it might go to your kids. But if your kids are minors, then there might be a stipulation in the will where there's like a legal guardian where you and that legal guardian could oversee the kids' inheritance while they were minors. But then once they become adults, you're kind of dependent on your kids legally. So it's kind of complicated, but they had a lot of laws about this. Is a common problem. We have a lot of written records of this. And again, it's no surprise that we find lots of written records and lots of literary discussions where people are saying, kids just aren't taking care of their mothers. Some things are kind of universal, right? So what was the best case scenario for most women? Remarriage, right? Can't count on your kids all the time. So remarriage is the best solution for support of a woman left alone by a deceased husband. Now, here it gets complicated because women often, again, remarriage is going to be their kind of their help. And what do you often need in many ancient cultures when you're getting married? You need to bring a dowry, right, which is like money. Now, what do you think the kids think about mom getting remarried? For emotional reasons, often they are against that, but there's an additional reason here why kids would be opposed to mom getting remarried, because she's taken that dowry, and what's that dowry coming from? It's coming out of your inheritance, right? So it gets really kind of thorny like that. So there are economic kinds of factors at play as well. So those are some background kind of considerations about what widows are facing in the ancient world. And there are a lot more widows who show up in the pages of the New Testament than orphans. The scribes and Pharisees are often castigated for devouring widows' houses out of greed. There's one parable where Jesus talks about a widow who wears down a corrupt judge who finally agrees to hear her case, if only because, she's her constant complaining is just driving us nuts. So he's like, I'll hear your complaint. And then you get a couple of widows who have their kids raised. So widows pop up all over the place in the New Testament. I want to talk about two passages where they show up, and I want to apply some of the knowledge we have to these texts, so it kind of tells us a little bit more what's going on below the surface. But there's one story in Acts chapter 6. So Acts is the story of the early church after Jesus' death and resurrection and ascension, and it's the story of the spread of the church, first in Jerusalem and then around the Mediterranean, with the apostles kind of preaching the good news. And in Acts chapter 6, we're still in Jerusalem at this point, in the early days of the church, right after Pentecost, which we just celebrated. And it talks about in Jerusalem, there are a bunch of people joining this new movement, including a bunch of widows. Some, it says, Hebrew and some Hellenists. What this means is Greek-speaking and Aramaic-speaking. So it's a multicultural kind of society here. And the Christian, it's basically all people coming out of Judaism at this point. So it's like Jewish Christian or Greek-speaking Jewish widows and Aramaic or kind of Hebrew speaking, and some of them are. And so the Greek speaking ones feel like they're getting neglected, like there's some some bias going on here, and the solution to this problem, where they're receiving handouts because they don't have anything to eat. And so this is something that the synagogue did, and now the church is doing. And so the apostles are there, and they're like, this is, we can't be constantly bothered by this. And so their solution is, we're going to appoint 7 deacons to take care of these kind of like daily affairs, because we apostles have to study the word and preach the word to the people. So one of the developments in the early church is directly in response to an issue of a proliferation of widows who are poor and hungry but need that kind of welfare taken care of. And so that's one interesting thing where we see widows, indirectly driving a certain kinds of development and the structure of the church from the earliest days. The other passage I want to look at, and this involves widows almost exclusively, is in the letter of 1 Timothy. Did anybody bring their Bible tonight? It's a Friday night. So I printed it out. So if you could pass these around, that. And while those are going around, this is from 1 Timothy chapter 5, verses 3 through 16. 1 Timothy is a letter written by Paul, the Apostle Paul, to Timothy, who is one of his co-helpers or helpers or co-workers as he's going around the Mediterranean preaching the good news and founding churches, Christian communities. And in this letter, Paul is writing to Timothy in the city of Ephesus. Ephesus is in modern day, it's on the western coast of modern day Turkey. One of the biggest cities in the Roman Empire. Probably a couple of 100,000 people. It's kind of hard to say for sure, but a major city. Paul has founded a church there, according to Acts, and then he's left to go off and do other things around the Mediterranean. And so the church there is a very young church. I mean, how long is Holy Spirit, how old is this church? When was it founded? Does anybody know? 1933. So this church is like decades and decades older than the church in Ephesus. This is a brand new church. It's just been around for a couple years. Thank you very much. It's not really kind of like gotten very organized. It's kind of settled, kind of got its leadership or organization settled. And so there's some problems going on. And Paul is writing to Timothy to give him advice on how to take care of some of these problems, how to preempt some problems, like how to appoint elders and deacons and this sort of thing. And he's talking about different groups of people that are, require special treatment. And one of those groups is widows. And he spends a long passage here talking about how you should deal with widows. He talks about how you should deal with older men, younger women. And let me just read this, and then we'll talk about it a little bit. He says, Paul says to Timothy, honor widows who are really widows. If a widow has children or grandchildren, they should first learn their religious duty to their own family and make some repayment to their parents, for this is pleasing in God's sight. The real widow, left alone, has set her hope on God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day, but the widow who lives for pleasure is dead even while she lives. Give these commands as well so that they may be above reproach. And whoever does not provide for relatives, and especially for family members, has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. And then he goes on to talk about, like a list or something like that. It says, let a widow be put on the list if she's not less than 60 years old and has been married only once. She must be well attested for her good works, as one who has brought up children, shown hospitality, washed the saints' feet, helped the afflicted, and devoted herself to doing good in every way, but refused to put younger widows on the list. For when their sensual desires alienate them from Christ, they want to marry, and so they incur condemnation for having violated their first pledge. Besides that, they learn to be idle, gadding about from house to house. They're not merely idle, but also gossips and busybodies, saying what they should not say. So I would have younger widows marry, bear children, manage households so as to give the adversary no occasion to revile us. For some have already turned away to follow Satan. If any believing woman has relatives who are really widows, let her assist them. Let the church not be burdened so that it can assist those who are real widows. All right, so kind of there's a lot here on the surface, but a lot kind of below the surface too. Paul is writing this letter, just like when you're writing letters, you don't bother kind of like spelling out all the context because you know the context of what you're writing about. Whoever you're writing to knows the context. You don't need to kind of spell it all out. So he doesn't spell everything out, but we can kind of like fill in some of the gaps here. So here, a couple things help this make sense in ways it might not otherwise make sense. First, we need to think about just the fact that they're scarce resources. If we, part of this sounds a little weird. Right? I mean, from the very beginning, what's one of the oddest things about this passage? Honor widows who are really widows. Anything there strike you? Real widows? Like, are there people running around pretending to be widows? That would be, that's not what he's talking about. And then he's talking about how we should support them and who we should, who is against supporting widows? No one's against, so what's going on here? First, you got to consider just a basic economic fact that's the same today as back then, which is scarce resources. In a perfect world, there would be infinite resources, right? And everybody would have everything they need. You would never say to a widow, sorry, we're not going to help you, if you had everything. But the fact is, there's limited resources. And so this is, again, is kind of hard for us to appreciate in a world where there's a government that with a social security, the safety net, where not everybody gets everything they need, but we have the government and also very large charities. I mean, I live in Memphis, which is the home to one of the largest and most successful charities in the world, St. Jude. I mean, they bring in a lot of money, right? So we kind of take it for granted that there are going to be groups that kind of like take care of the needy, but that's not always the case. It's sometimes easy to forget just how unusual these undertakings are. And so to the modern ear, it may sound cold and heartless to say that there's a class of needy individuals who might have no claim to material assistance like what we might hear here. There are a lot of churches that have considerable wealth that they can do a lot of good with. And even those churches that are wealthy can't do everything they want to do. I mean, there's a limit to how much you can help people. And so from this, it appears that the church in Ephesus doesn't have enough resources to help all the widows who are there. It's also important to remember that the word church in ancient Greek that we have here does not refer to a building. There were no buildings that were churches until probably the 3rd century or maybe later. So a church is just a group of people. So even if they wanted to sell their church building and liquidate it and have cash to help everybody who needed help, they had no building where they could do that. So you've got to make trade-offs. There are advantages and disadvantages. Whenever you make a choice to help one person or one group of people, that's something else you're not able to do with that money. That's somebody, if you help them, you can't help them. So you've got to make kind of hard decisions about what to do with your resources. And you have to set priorities. And so this is what Paul's kind of talking through, is what can we do and what should we do? What's more important, what's less important? And in this sense, so have you ever heard the saying, there's no such thing as a free lunch? Well, in this sense, it's literally true. Part of what you do, on a daily basis in the church, it seems, again, kind of this carries over from Jewish synagogues in the 1st century, is a daily food distribution for people who don't have food. They would show up. Again, we see that in Acts chapter 6, where that seems to have been one of the customs of the early church. And again, if you provide assistance to one group, that means you're taking it out of the mouths, literally, of some other group. How do we decide who gets our finite resources out of our community chest? So distinguishing what he calls real widows from those who are not real widows is a pretty critical process. Again, he's not saying you're pretending to be a widow. He's saying there are widows and there are widows. And so this is where some of the details of this passage seems kind of arbitrary, but you're okay, this is starting to make sense. So if you can't help everybody, you got to have some kind of criteria, right? So what's one of the criteria? He says, who's a real widow? Number one. Who goes on the list?
Wouldn't it be somebody that doesn't have any kind of family support?
Yeah, okay, so somebody who doesn't have family support and, I thought you were raising your hand. No? Okay. The first thing it says, if she's not less than 60 years old. So if you say, are there widows younger than 60? I just gave you those stats. Lots of widows younger than 60. But if you say, 60 years old, what does that automatically do to the number of people you're providing assistance to? Really reduces it, right? Because there are not as many people over 60 years old. Another thing, and this is not what he's, He's not thinking like an insurance company or an actuary, but thinking like an actuary or an insurance company helps you understand this. So if you say only those who are 60 or older, that means there are fewer people. But also, if we're only going to help people who are 60 and older, how long do we have to help them for? A shorter amount of time. Again, he's not thinking like an insurance company, like trying to set rates or that kind of thing, but that automatically like says, okay, we've got a certain number of resources. Who deserves them, right? If you're older and you don't have family. Now, this is where it says, let me see. It says, has been married only once. Now, some translations say husband of, or the wife of one husband, but they weren't marrying. They weren't polygamous at this time. It talks about being married only once. Now, how does that affect this equation? If you're a wife or widow, you're 60, and you've only been married once, this kind of relates to kind of what you said. So if you've only been married once, what do you not have as many of? You don't have as many children and grandchildren, right? So if you've been married, which was very common. I was married, now he died, I'm widowed, I married somebody else, he died, I'm widowed. So along the way, you accumulate a number of children of your own and stepchildren and grandchildren. So people who are in the class that he's kind of like sketching out here, they're older and they've only had one husband, so they have fewer children who can take care of them. That's exactly right. So this is kind of like common sense. It sounds like an arbitrary list of rules, but you can see how it kind of like fits together within the community, right? And so part of kind of the reciprocity that is expected is, well, if these are people who've been part of the community and have helped with the community, maybe with orphans, then they get a claim on our resources more than someone who's not really been part of the community. Again, makes sense. You can see how you could see how someone's not there, not plugged in, hasn't been plugged into the kind of community where you kind of give favors and receive favors, might not be very needy. Because if you have a lot of spare time to gad about and be gossips and be idle, that might be an indication of your relative affluence. And if we've got to help somebody who's like a poor widow and a rich widow, I mean, who's the real widow according to Paul? It's the poor. It's the poor one, right? And so he's not like, he has some pretty sharp words here for younger widows, right? I was reading, I thought I heard laughter as I was reading some of that. I don't know, it might have been like snide laughter. He paints a picture of younger widows, not a very attractive picture. They're kind of, they're gossiping, they're idle, and they're, he says something about their sensual desires or something like that. He's not against remarriage. In fact, he's like, this is a normal thing to do. And if you're going to get remarried, get remarried. He has no problem with that. But if you're going to get remarried, don't be a burden on the church. Perfectly fine. So, but he says, I would have younger widows marry, bear children, and manage their household so as to give the adversary no occasion to revile. There's also, think about this, he doesn't spell this out, but it's pretty easy to imagine the possible scandal and opportunity for abuse when you imagine a situation where you have a bunch of single women dependent on older men for financial assistance. That's an easily abuse, that's a situation, it's very easy to imagine abuse. And so partly it's, women, you're kind of out of control, but also it's like to remove a near occasion of sin from men who are in charge of giving out, goodies to the young single women. We could put that in different ways, I guess, but you understand what I'm talking about here. So there are harsh words for the younger widows, but who are the harshest words reserved for here? It's not really the widows. who's worse than an unbeliever? The family that's not taking care of their mothers and grandmothers. You've denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. And so here, there's I remember talking about this with an economist, an economic historian who's a colleague of mine. He said there's a term for this called moral hazard. Moral hazard is a term for when, basically, when there's no harm done to you if you act in a risky situation. You're gonna be riskier if there's no penalty for you. Like if you're driving the company car and you don't have to fix the company car if it gets broken, how are you going to treat the company car like your car? No, you're going to treat it like you're going to run into the ground. So when you're able to act with impunity, you're going to act with impunity. And so moral hazard. So Paul is talking about moral hazard here. He's saying, all of you families who have widows in your midst, don't dump them on the church. The church can't take care of all. If you're able to care for your mothers and grandmothers, care for your mothers and grandmothers. The church is not here just to take care of the widows. We will if we have to, but if this widow has a family, the family should be taking care of them. And that just, that makes, again, it's common sense when you think about it. He doesn't spell it all out, but you can say, this is a church that has finite resources. It's trying to do all the good they can, but you can't do all the good you can. So you have to kind of like make priorities. You want to do God's will. It's not always obvious how to do God's will. The earliest Christians believed that Jesus rose from the dead, and that was a decisive intervention in human history by the God of Israel, and it affected everything. It wasn't always obvious how it affected everything. So Jesus has risen. So does that mean we can still eat pork or not? It wasn't obvious, but it was like, this is relevant. Jesus has risen. Should we get married? Should we not get married? Should we, remain single after we're, become, It's not obvious how you connect those dots, but they're like, it's relevant to everything, so we have to figure it out. Jesus is risen, so which widow should we take care of? Jesus didn't say, but it's their conviction that Jesus' death and resurrection is relevant to everything, so we're going to do our best to figure out what God would have us, what Jesus would have us do in the situation we're put into. So I could go into more detail, but I was told 35, 40 minutes is about it. So I'm going to stop there. I hope that gives you some better appreciation for some of these kind of situations they'd find themselves in and how early Christians were trying to think their way through situations that would face them every day. Again, we're here in the church. We've been around for like a long, long, long time. And so we kind of have precedents. We kind of like know how Christians have done things in the past. And so we kind of look to that. Here, the church has only been around for like 10 or 20 years. There is no precedent for what a church is supposed to do. They're trying to figure it out as best they can. So I hope that gives you some appreciation for that. But I'll stop there, see if you have any questions or comments, and I'll do my best to.
What's the ratio of men to women?
We don't know.
How easy was it for a young widow to find?
Oh, how many available men? Well, like I said, you have lower life expectancies for men, so it's probably hard. It's not, and so if women can't find men to get married, in extreme cases, not in first century Rome, but in extreme cases, this is why you have many societies that are polygamous, because there are only so many men and so many women. And so I'm not endorsing polygamy. Please don't. Here I am on camera. It's going to be on YouTube. I'm not endorsing polygamy, but that's the solution that many societies take, is like, just like you say, there are only so many men and so many women. And, probably the men who are marrying multiple women are probably not just thinking, how can I take care of all the women? But anyway, so, but in the church, so we don't know the exact numbers, but there is that kind of imbalance. Also, it seems like there were more women in the church who were drawn to the church than men. That seems to be kind of like pretty perennial. It seems like that's been the case throughout history. And for early critics of Christianity, that was one thing they pointed out. I mean, this is one of these kind of like stereotypes or, kind of biases they had. Said, look at all the women that are drawn to this church. That's evidence of itself of how ridiculous of an organization it is. That was kind of what critics said, right? So even though I don't agree with that, of course, that's evidence of the kind of gender imbalance that you had in the church. It was kind of a disproportionately female organization, which would make what you're talking about kind of hard, right?
Thank you.
There's a question, yeah?
When he talks about whoever does not provide for relatives, and especially for family members, has denied the faith, and at worst is an unbeliever. That's pretty strong.
That's pretty strong, yeah. So, it's, and I'm sorry? On like excommunicating you? Probably not. But this connects to, in the letter of James, which I read from the very beginning, he's talking about what's faith and, what's the relationship between faith and works or faith and deeds. And James says, faith without works is dead. He says, even the demons believe, even they believe and shudder, but he's saying belief is not enough. Put your money where your mouth, put your money where your mouth is. That you say you're a believer, but if you're like, letting people, starve, then you're, well, he says you're worse than an unbeliever. But yeah, we don't know that they were excommunicating people, like actually treating them, saying you're just like an unbeliever. We don't have any evidence of that, but it's hard to say for sure. But you're right; those are very strong words. Yeah, yeah.
Was it also somewhat of a silent thing where, again, a brother and he died, and then he was single, that the wife was.
All right, so what you're talking about, and I wish we knew, so he's asking about a custom. This is in ancient Israel, and it's mentioned in the book of Ruth. We know very little about it. They don't spell it out, but it's a custom called levirate marriage, where the custom was if a man died and had not produced an heir, it was the custom of the man's next, like maybe his brother or something like that, to marry or to father a child with the widow. So, and like I said, that's basically part of the story of Ruth, right? And there's someone who says, I don't want to like step up to the plate and do that duty. Partly, and a lot of people would not do it because then it had inheritance implications. Again, it's not very clear, but it seems like that custom was not any longer practiced among Israelites in the first century. It's much older, but that's another solution for some of the things we're talking about. How do you care for the widows and orphans? That's right. Is there anybody? Yeah.
I'm just trying to get an idea of the church at that time. And you get the impression that it was a young church. I mean, literally.
A young church? Is that what you said?
I don't know what the average age of a person was at that time. What would be the average age of a man dying, average age of a woman, all that kind of thing. But it wasn't very long. People really would not go to help with it, as we have. And so it was really a young church.
Young church in terms of the age of the individuals in it, you mean? Yeah, it's really hard to say. I mean, of course, infant mortality rates were through the roof, and that accounted for a lot of the shorter lifespans. If you were able to make it into adulthood, it wasn't like unbelievable for people to live to 60 or 70, and so it would have been a younger church, but not like everybody above 40 had died off or anything like that. I wish what we know. If you want to know like what it's like on a daily basis for the kind of daily kind of situations Christians faced, the best book to read is Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, because it like talks about old people and young, all the arguments they had about all kind, rich and poor. And I thought you were talking about when you said a young church. Yeah, the church itself was very young, because if he's writing that letter in around the year 50, I mean, Christianity had not been around for 20 years. I mean, if we think about Jesus' death being the beginning of Christianity, death and resurrection, I mean, today, most people who are Christian, how did they really get to be Christian? Most of them were born into Christian families, right? In the year 50, almost nobody was born into a Christian family because there was no Christianity, there was no church until like the day before yesterday. And so that's a very unusual kind of situation too, where most of you, I'm guessing, grew up in Christian Catholic families, and that's why you kind of are what you're. In the year 50, in the city of Corinth or in the city of Ephesus, almost nobody in that church would have been born as a Christian. Almost every single person would have been a convert from something else, Judaism or for some form of Greek or Roman paganism. And so it would have been a young church in that sense, in terms of like the age of individual, members. A little bit hard to say. I wish we had more, attendance records, but we don't from those early churches. So, any other questions? Yeah.
Well, you talked earlier about the synagogue had similar type of things. Because most apostles were Jewish to begin with, wouldn't this be modeled somewhat from that tradition?
Right. Yeah. So whether it's the new members who are part of it themselves or are outsiders looking at this thing, if you say we're a church, the term is ecclesia, like ecclesiastical. That's the Greek word. It just means like an assembly. If you were to tell somebody, yeah, we're a church, they say like, well, what's a church? I mean, we all know what a church is because it's been around for 2,000 years. But if someone said, what's a church? They might compare it to there are a lot of kind of civic, they're kind of like trade guilds where people got together just like this. All of us, like stone cutters, would get together on a Friday night and have a potluck meal. We might help each other. We would take up collection, and when you die, we're going to like make sure you've got a grave. So we might think, is the church like one of these kind of civic associations, or is it like a synagogue? And most of them would have said, well, I guess whatever we are now, it's kind of like a synagogue. That's just kind of the norm we take for granted. And so we kind of do what synagogues do. There were other kinds of organizations too. And Rome got a little uneasy about some of these groups that would meet, especially if you met in secret, because whenever a group's meeting privately, they might be plotting something against the government. And so, there were all kinds of challenges they faced. And sometimes Jews and synagogues they didn't like plot to overthrow the government, but they did have a uneasy relationship. So Rome sometimes could drop the hammer on you indiscriminately. Yeah. I'm sorry. Yeah. So he asked about, what would have been assumed a church should be. What's a church like? What is a church? And he asked, since most of the apostles were Jewish, would they have kind of reflexively said our group here should operate kind of like a synagogue? And I kind of gave a long answer, kind of saying, yeah, sort of. Basically, I mean, from the inside, you're kind of looking at yourself and say, what kind of a thing are they? And then also from the outside, when people are trying to make sense of you, like what, we all know what, even people in our society, if you're not part of a church, you kind of know what a church is. You don't have to explain what a church is, even to people who don't like your church, right? They kind of know what it is. But in a society where there is no such thing, you'd say, well, let me compare it to something else. And you might say, it's kind of like a synagogue. And most people were not members of synagogues in ancient Rome, but they knew who the Jews were, and they knew kind of what a synagogue was. So yeah, in terms, a church is not exactly like a synagogue, but a lot of those functions did kind of carry over, right? And partly because of them, a lot of them were Jewish. Yeah. Like the English word church, I think it's a Germanic or Old English, kirk, something like that. I don't know the whole etymology how we got from ecclesia to church. That I don't know, but it's. But like I said, the main thing to keep in mind is that a church in the ancient world was not a building. It was a group of people. Because until almost the year 300, there were no, I mean, Christianity was not a legal religion, and so you could not have a building that was publicly identified as a Christian worship.
St. Peter, you know, it's like in caves and things like that sometimes. But
Right, people would meet in church, you know, in terms of the building, it would be people's houses. Yeah. Yeah, and I can't trace the whole history in terms of, you know, the language, but yeah. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.